Hi all, welcome to Regents Review Session 7. This is Miss Winans. Today we will cover the topic of ecology. There are two types of cellular respiration that can occur in a cell. You have aerobic respiration. In aerobic, you hear air. Aerobic is going to use oxygen. And then you have anaerobic. So in anaerobic, you hear no. Anaerobic is going to not use oxygen. As you can see in the slide presentation, aerobic uses oxygen to make 36 ATP. Anaerobic does not use oxygen to make 2 ATP. Since aerobic makes 36 ATP and anaerobic makes 2 ATP, aerobic is the most efficient way of making ATP from molecules of glucose. And that is why most organisms depend on aerobic cellular respiration. That's why we have to breathe in and out every single day, because the oxygen that we inhale allows us to make 36 ATP. Anaerobic respiration also will happen. It will happen when oxygen does not get to our cells in time. In the case of mammals, the waste product of anaerobic respiration is a substance called lactic acid. Lactic acid will build up and cause cramping because the muscles are burned by the acid. Eventually, once activity stops, this will go away due to the waste being carried away by the circulatory system. The biggest misconception with food chains and food webs is what this arrow means. A lot of students think that food chains and food webs demonstrate who eats who. But really, if that's what the arrow meant, that would mean that the grass eats the bunny and the bunny eats the fox. And that's clearly not what happens in nature. So it's very important that you understand that this arrow represents energy transfer. Particularly the transfer of the molecule glucose, C6H12O6, which we all know that we use in cellular respiration to convert into ATP equals energy. So again, the arrow in a food chain and food web represent energy transfer. Although you can infer who eats who, the arrow indicates energy transfer. Another thing that students have difficulty with is the difference between a food chain and a food web. This is a food chain. It only shows part of a food web. So it's going to have a producer, a primary consumer, the first to eat, which we refer to as the herbivore, a secondary consumer, which is the second to eat, which is considered a carnivore, and it could have a tertiary consumer. Food webs are going to show you multiple food chains combined. So if you have this caterpillar here, you can indicate that the caterpillar gives energy to the iguana and the bird. So a food chain shows one part of a food web. You do need to know some key organisms in an ecosystem. The autotroph, the producer, is at the start of the food chain. They automatically have food. They can produce their own food. Remember, we're talking about food. Remember, we're talking about organic matter. Particularly the organic matter we're talking about is C6H12O6, which is glucose. So these are going to be, for the most part, organisms that can photosynthesize. There is a process called chemiosynthesis, which allows organisms to synthesize their own glucose from substances at the mid-Atlantic ridge. Chemicals. I think it's a sulfur compound. So there are other organisms that are autotroph producers that don't photosynthesize, but it's any organism that can produce their own organic matter. The next is the consumer. This is the organism they have to eat, they have to hunt, they have to gather, they have to collect their organic matter from the environment. These are going to be your herbivores, which are typically your primary, your first consumers, your first to eat. So you have your primary consumers, and then your carnivores, which eat meat. These are going to be your second and third to eat. Consumers, and they are going to, again, have to take organic matter from their external environment, and they'll get different amounts of organic matter depending on which level of the food chain they eat from. There are two types of carnivores. You have the predators. These are going to be the guys who are going to hunt. And on the next slide, you're going to see the scavengers. These are going to be the organisms that are going to go around and gather their organic matter from dead carcasses like vultures or crows. All right, this is your energy pyramid. It's another way of illustrating that food chain that we saw. So again, we're saying who gives energy to who. So since grass and plants can get their energy from the sun, they're going to be our producers. The producers produce glucose through the process of photosynthesis. They then convert that glucose into ATP through the process of respiration. Whatever glucose is not converted into ATP is what gets passed on to the vole. The vole then takes that glucose and converts it into ATP. And whatever glucose is not used by the vole is then passed on to the barn owl. So what's going to happen is at each level of the food chain, some energy is going to be lost to the environment through heat, because that organism is going to go through its own metabolic processes. It's going to convert that ATP and then maintain homeostasis. That requires energy. So what happens in a food chain is when an organism eats another organism, they only obtain the leftover glucose. And that's why at each level of the energy pyramid, there's less and less energy available. That is also going to dictate biomass. So there's going to be a lot more plants in the ecosystem than there are going to be barn owls. That's because the barn owl has to eat a lot more. So there has to be more voles than barn owls in the ecosystem, because if there are more voles, okay, they can supply the owl. But if there are more owls, there would simply not be enough food to support this size of a population. and the population would be unstable. So again, energy pyramids will show you not only the amount of energy available at each trophic level, which is each energy level, which is each section of the food chain, it also shows you the amount of each organism that can exist at each level. In this video, we are taking a look at a graph, and we're trying to figure out what the graph is showing you. So in our first graph, we're taking a look at a paramecium, Paramecium aurelia, and we're showing that over time the population is growing, 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 and then it seems to level off. Okay, and then we look at another population of Paramecium, Paramecium caudatum, and you see that it's grown alone, and it is showing you the same growth pattern. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's growing, and then something is causing that population to level off. Now, in this experiment, what it looks like they did in round 3, they combined the Paramecium aurelia, which is indicated by the blue line, and the Paramecium caudatum, which is represented by the orange line. And as we can see, the caudatum does not demonstrate the same growth pattern that occurred when it was grown alone, whereas the aurelia seems to be showing the same growth pattern. This indicates that both aurelia and caudatum probably compete for the same resource, and it looks like the aurelia is the better competitor, and in the game of life, the winners survive to reproduce. The losers, unfortunately, die out. So this is a diagram showing you competition between two species, and they're showing you natural selection over a limited resource. Populations that have a short lifespan are able to exploit natural resources, and they can show an exponential growth. In fact, almost all organisms will show some point of exponential growth, which means that the growth of the population will grow exponentially, which means that the resources have to be unlimited, because this means no matter how large the population grows, we always have enough resources to support them, which isn't 100% accurate, because we all know that we have limited resources. We have limited factors in ecosystems. So exponential growth is not realistic growth. There are populations that show exponential growth, but they tend to die off very quickly, meaning they have short lifespans. The only organisms on the planet that have very long lifespans that are still demonstrating exponential growth are humans, because humans have yet to reach their carrying capacity. However, when we do reach our carrying capacity, we will experience a different type of growth. That growth is called logistic population growth. It's logical. It makes sense. We know that resources are limited on the planet. We have to fight for limiting factors within an environment. And organisms have to compete for niches. So they have to find out where they fit best, and then they have to compete to stay the best in order to live long enough to reproduce. So logistic growth is what is demonstrated in almost every living population that has a long lifespan. And what happens is the population will grow and grow in a time period where there's limited resources, and then eventually it'll reach what is called the carrying capacity, which means that we're running out of resources. And then what you're going to see is you're going to see that concept of dynamic equilibrium. This idea that the fact that the population is going to compete for limited resources. So if we go above the carrying capacity, we're going to have a high level of competition. Organisms are going to die. That's going to cause a drop in the population. Then maybe some of the resources will redeem themselves, and then so we'll reproduce some more. Then we have to compete again, and so on and so forth. And this kind of fluctuation around the carrying capacity is a stable ecosystem. I always tell students to think of a carrying capacity as the amount of, or the number of organisms that a particular environment can hold. For example, I can hold 4 basketballs in my arm. And if I try to carry the 5th basketball, all the basketballs will fall out. The population would crash. That is my carrying capacity. My carrying capacity for my arms are 4 basketballs. That's the amount that I can hold without the population, without the basketballs crashing. So you want to think of carrying capacity as the amount of limiting factors that are available that would prevent competition. Once you exceed the carrying capacity, competition will ensue. Some organisms will die. Once you go below the carrying capacity, competition will decrease and organisms will start to be able to reproduce again. Okay, so ecological succession is the best way for a destroyed population to redeem itself, which basically is to leave it alone, let nature take its course. So in the early 1900s, there was a volcano called Krakatoa. It erupted and completely destroyed an island. The island was half of it sunk into the ocean. The rest of it remained, but it was covered in igneous rock due to the lava that covered the island. We thought the island was gone, never to come back again. But lo and behold, over time, ecological succession took place. And basically what happens is we have these organisms called pioneer organisms. Pioneer organisms are organisms that can change rock into soil. The most common organism, which is called a lichen, Annie algae and Fred fungi took a lichen to each other, and now their marriage is on the rocks. Lichen is a combination of a fungi and an algae, and they're able to digest rock and turn it into very young, immature soil. As these pioneer organisms die, they add nutrients to the soil. The more nutrients are added to the soil, the more complex the organisms that can live. We all know during algae season that there's pollen in the air, that there's seeds in the air. The air can carry and the water can carry seeds of other organisms. If there's enough nutrients in the soil, those seeds will germinate. If there's not enough nutrients in the soil, those seeds will not germinate. So in the next stage, we only see grasses because, again, we don't have a lot of nutrients in our soil yet, so we can't be that complex. We also haven't broken down this hard igneous rock yet, so there's not enough room for the roots to penetrate into the soil. But lo and behold, these organisms will die, adding more organic matter, adding more nutrients to the soil. So now as the wind and the water carry more seeds, maybe we have some birds that are landing here. They might go to the bathroom, and inside they have a little package of seeds over here, and we might get things like cherry trees. We might get things like berry bushes. So we're getting more complicated. These organisms will drop leaves. They will also die and add more nutrients to the soil. And now maybe following the birds, we have the squirrels, and the squirrels carry the acorns, and the acorns carry the seeds for these big shade trees. And now at this point, we have broken down our soil enough so that there's enough room for the roots. There's also enough nutrients, and lo and behold, after this disaster, we have returned to our climax community, which is a stable ecosystem with a high level of biodiversity. Remember, the more amount of organisms you have living in a given area, the more niches you have, the more specialized the organisms are at taking care of their environment. So that is ecological succession.